I'm a simple man. I like rocks, and I like using them on the tabletop. Whether it is for Dungeons & Dragons, Warhammer, or any other tabletop RPG or wargame, you can never go wrong with some rocks. I figure it is about time I show you, my wonderful audience, my technique when creating the best terrain piece for any game you play. Without further ado, let's dive in. You will only need these few supplies to make some easy to build rocks and hills. Number 1, foam. Now there are a number of types of foam out there, but I prefer your typical insulation foam you can snag up at your big home improvement stores. A great substitute I also like to use is expanding foam as well. Number 2, Mod Podge. If somehow Mod Podge has not become a staple in your terrain building process, well, it should now. This stuff is used as a sealant to preserve your beautiful creation. And number 3, drywall compound. Also called joint compound or spackle, this stuff creates a cool texture that allows you to shape and move it around for a long while before it dries and settles. Now it does have a few drawbacks, but I will discuss that later in the video. With all of the main ingredients out of the way, let's get started on these boulders.
It's not just a boulder, it's a rock.
Thank you, SpongeBob. Forming up some foam rocks is the first step in our process. Now you can chip and carve away at the foam using a number of tools, hot wire cutters, Proxxon table, and so on, but I personally like to use the good old-fashioned knife and finger tearing trick. It is unpredictable and fun, also super messy. For this tutorial, I will be building up a handful of rocks with a few varying shapes and sizes. Hopefully these ideas and steps along the way are suitable for you when you are making your own scratch-built terrain for your tabletop games. Now it takes a little bit of time, but I am happy with the 4 rocks I have carved up, and we are ready to move on to the next step. Adding a base to these rocks is not required, but if you are so inclined, there are a number of options you can choose from. For a smaller build like this that would cover 90% of the surface area of the base, I prefer to use peel and stick vinyl tiles that you can get from any big box hardware store. These tiles act as a great base. They are already super thin to hide the fact that your terrain piece is not just sitting on the table, and more importantly, it is easy to cut out using some scissors. I just trace out my rocks and cut out the perfect sized base. Following the base creation, we have to adhere the foam pieces to each other as well as the rocks to our base. I go the quick and easy route here and use my hot glue gun. Just be quick and try to whisk away any of the wisps that fly around when using the hot glue. Now if you don't have any hot glue, PVA or white glue will work just fine for standard insulation foam. If you didn't get all the wisps, or maybe some of the rock shapes are a little awkward at this point, don't you worry. It is in the next step that we will cover up any imperfections and maybe create a few more. Now on to my favorite part, the joint compound. After using this product on a number of foam pieces and builds, I can tell you it is best if you apply it to your build with a thin layer. I suggest having a water cup nearby to thin down the product a little bit. There are a couple reasons for this. First off is drying time. The thinner the layer that covers up your entire build, it will dry significantly faster. And the second reason is if you apply it in a big glob, it will start to crack and do things you most likely don't want. I like to think that this part is best because you can't do much wrong. You just glop it all over the terrain piece, you can make a mess of things, pretend you are back in art class as a kiddo, and, just go crazy. In these shots here, I have just finished the joint compound step, and things are still wet and movable. You can see some odd details, lines, sharp points, and so on. This will show up after it dries, and this is completely fine. Now in this next shot, this is a number of hours later. You can still see some of those details I mentioned, and if there are some imperfections or too much for you, just grab some high grit sandpaper and give it a few swipes, or just be a barbarian and chip away at it with your fingers. Anything you sand down, chip away, or any other imperfections you find will be covered up in this next step. Now, I am sure most of you are familiar with the Mod Podge step, but it would not be a complete tutorial if I skipped this one by. Get yourself a big old container of Mod Podge, mix it in with some black ink and paint, and just coat it all over everything. This does 2 big things for us here. These rocks can get bumped and moved all around your gaming board, and they will become pretty damage resistant. And 2, some of those sharp details and almost chalky feel of the dried joint compound will be smoothed out and gone. Once again, we take our time, cover up every little detail, and let it dry for a number of hours. So for our next step, and this one is totally optional, is to add some rocks and sand to our build. This is just another way to add more grit and detail to your rocks. I try to find sections and areas that look a little bland that I want to accentuate later in the painting step. I take some watered down PVA glue and plop it down in those sections. And then I just sprinkle on a small amount of stone and sand mix. I let that dry, and if I'm feeling extra motivated, I will add another coating of watered down PVA just to make it extra secure. The key here is not to cover up everything you just worked on with glue and the little sand pebbles. That can create an odd looking piece. Just scatter the stones and sand around and just don't go overboard. Once all that is dry, I run outside and prime these rocks black. And once that is complete, we finally start seeing these rocks come alive with some painting. But I guess rocks can't come alive. Anyways, I will be doing your typical basic grade technique for all these little rocks and hills. The overall goal I've set when grading these rocks and boulders is to be placed on any table. I want them to be basic, like myself, so I keep this in mind with the painting process as well. The key is adding some variety to the colors to make it not look so dull and boring. After dry brushing up from a dark gray to a lighter gray, I take those brown and green inks and start making some concoctions. The inks I water down about 50-50 and I blend them here and there. Sometimes I'll do half and half, and others I won't blend it in at all. I apply these watered down inks in spots where I think it would look neat and create a moss or dirt bleeding effect. Now when these inks dry, they can create a water line that can be noticed. This is when I go back over them with some dry brushing of other colors to really hide those marks and bring more color and interest into these rocks and hills. Once all the main colors are painted and dry brushed on these rocks, I go over the areas with white. Just be very careful, you don't want to overdo it. Maybe even an off-white would be better, but it all depends on the look you are going for. With that, all of our painting is done, and so are our rocks. The intention of not placing any flocking or any other extra detail is to give me the opportunity to place these terrain pieces on any table, whether it resides in a rocky canyon, a swamp bog, or deep underground. I also hope that you found this video useful and can take some of these ideas to make your own awesome terrain. Also, just make sure to check out the Patreon and do all of the other socials. Until next time, folks, I want to thank you all for watching, and of course, happy gaming.